Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is James Otteson. I'm a professor of economics and business ethics here at Wake Forest University, and I'm privileged to serve as the executive director of the Eudaimonia Institute here at Wake Forest, which, in conjunction with the Z. Smith Reynolds Library, is sponsoring the event this evening. It's my distinct privilege and pleasure to welcome you all here. The Eudaimonia Institute was founded not quite 3 years ago with a mission to support investigation into the nature of and the institutions, the public institutions that support eudaimonia, which was Aristotle's word for happiness, flourishing, genuine well-being. The Institute aims to foster research and scholarship that seeks to understand these institutes and these institutions, not just with an eye towards merely theoretical understanding, but also with an eye towards potentially actually improving human well-being. One of the signature offerings of the Eudaimonia Institute is an annual event called the Noesis Lecture. Noesis is an ancient Greek word meaning thought or intelligence, but more particularly, it was Plato's word for the highest level of human knowledge. So the Noesis Lecture is reserved for those individuals who have succeeded to a level of human understanding and human achievement that is unparalleled, that has contributed both to human knowledge and to human betterment that warrants singular recognition. Our speaker this evening is a paradigm example of such an intellectual leader. Professor Steven Pinker is an experimental psychologist who conducts research into visual cognition, psycholinguistics, and social relations, among many other things. He grew up in Montreal, Canada. He earned his BA from McGill and his PhD from Harvard University. He is currently Johnstone Professor of Psychology at Harvard, and he's taught also at Stanford and at MIT. Professor Pinker has won numerous prizes for his research, for his teaching, and for his now 10 books and counting. There's another on the way. His books include The Language Instinct, which was the first book of his that I came into contact with now more than almost 2 decades ago. How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, Better Angels of Our Nature, and The Sense of Style. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Humanist of the Year, a recipient of 9 honorary doctorates, one of Foreign Policy's World's Top 100 Intellectuals and Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World Today. He is also chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary, which puts some pressure not only on him, I suppose, but also on people introducing him. He writes frequently for the New York Times, for The Guardian, and many other publications. His most recent book, which is the subject of his address tonight, is this one, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. It came out just last year. On behalf of the Z. Smith Reynolds Library and Wake Forest University, please join me in welcoming the Eudaimonia Institute's 2nd annual Noesis lecturer, Professor Steven Pinker.
Thank you very much. From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as imponderable as these questions may seem, many people have answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Or, our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe, but have more trouble putting their finger on what they do believe. In Enlightenment Now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the Enlightenment. namely that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. And it occurs to me that I could have called the book Noesis now. I could have called the book Eudaimonia now. I chose Enlightenment now because my Greek is a little rusty, but it is particularly fitting that I be speaking at an institute devoted to this very concept of human flourishing. One could even say that the argument that I plan to make is that eudaimonia achieved through noesis is the highest human goal. Now, many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them, again with the conspicuous exception of this very institute and whoever came up with the name for this lecture. But with everyone else, the ideals of the Enlightenment are likely to fade into the background, to become identified with the status quo or the establishment. Other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I have tried to do. The Enlightenment, I suggest, centers on 4 themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the realization that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable, because as soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you explain why you're right, or why other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. We are liable to generalize from anecdotes. We reason from stereotypes. We all seek evidence that confirms our beliefs and ignore evidence that disconfirms them. And we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can seek to understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. A major Enlightenment theme was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. Science, moreover, provides not just technical know-how, but fundamental insights about the human condition. Naturalism. The universe has no goal or purpose related to human welfare, with the implication that if we want to improve that welfare, we have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Entropy. In a closed system without input of energy, disorder increases. Things fall apart, stuff happens. Not because the universe has it in for us, but because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. Evolution. Humans are products of a competitive process, which selects for reproductive success, not well-being. As one of the great Enlightenment thinkers, Immanuel Kant, put it, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be built. This leads to the third Enlightenment ideal, humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures, to enhance their eudaimonia. Now, enhancing human flourishing, you might think, well, who could possibly be opposed to that? Well, in fact, there are alternatives to humanism as a source of value, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. By default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain mainly of our biological relatives, our close friends, our allies, and cute little furry baby animals. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through under the pressure of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, such as education, journalism, art, mobility, and even pure reason. As soon as I engage in debate with you, I can't insist that only my interests count because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. The very nature of reason militates against egocentrism and selfishness because there is nothing special about the pronoun I as opposed to the pronoun you. Finally, that leads to progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to the goal of reducing suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Now, you might ask, if human nature doesn't change, how could progress even be possible? And an answer from the Enlightenment is that it is possible through benign institutions that allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to push back against entropy, to magnify the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln called them, such as reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our thirst for dominance and vengeance. What do I mean by Enlightenment institutions? Well, some of them that we continue to enjoy include democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies, and a free press. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, I have found that if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well. Because I found that most intellectuals hate progress, and intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means that you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-do-ism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to the Voltaire character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Well, as it happened, Professor Pangloss is what we would today call a pessimist, because a true optimist would believe there can be much better worlds than the one that we find today. But this is irrelevant because the question of whether progress has taken place is not a matter of having a sunny temperament or looking on the bright side or seeing the glass as half full. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness, all the things that I have learned are precisely the remit, the goal of the Eudaimonia Institute. If they have increased over time, that would be progress. Well, let's go to the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. But then, with the discovery of vaccination, of sanitation, antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy at birth has increased to 71 years worldwide, averaging across the entire planet. In wealthier countries, like those in Europe and America, more than 80 years. But there's been enormous progress in Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa as well. For most of human history, the biggest contributor to low life expectancy was the death of children who are particularly vulnerable and whose deaths bring down the average a lot. In Sweden, 250 years ago, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden brought its rate of child mortality down by a factor of about 100, and every other region of the world has followed suit, such as in North America, Canada, in Asia, South Korea, in Latin America, Chile, and in Africa, Ethiopia, which has brought its rate of child mortality down from 25% to 6% in just 25 years or so. Still too high, but the progress is continuing. Mothers, too, were vulnerable in giving birth. In Sweden, 250 years ago, about 1% of mothers died with each childbirth. Sweden brought its rate of maternal mortality down by a factor of about 250, and other countries followed suit, including the United States, Malaysia, and in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia. Health. For most of history, the biggest contributor to early death consisted of infectious disease, no longer a major source of mortality in rich countries, but still devastating in many poor countries, particularly to children. But just in the last 15 years, the rate of death from the 5 most lethal childhood infectious diseases has come down: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories to feed an active young male, and for most of human history, countries were unable to grow that many calories until the agricultural revolution in England in the 18th century, with the discovery of advances in agronomy, such as crop rotation, later the invention of synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of agriculture, the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids, and transportation networks that could bring food from farm to table. England developed the ability to feed its people, as did the United States and France. More recently, China, India, and to a large extent the world as a whole is able to grow sufficient calories. Now, this would be a dubious achievement if all those calories were just going to making fat people fatter. But in fact, they have brought down the rate of undernourishment, which used to afflict 35% of people in the developing world, not so long ago, and that has been brought down to less than 15%, first in Latin America, then in Asia, and more recently in sub-Saharan Africa. As a result, famine, which was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and which could bring devastation to any region, no longer exists in any but the most remote and war-torn corners of the world. Prosperity. Poverty needs no explanation. It's the natural state of humankind. What needs an explanation is wealth or prosperity. And indeed, for this graph, which plots the gross world product from the year 1 to the present, shows that for more than 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high on the graph. Then, with the Industrial Revolution and advances in technology, such as steam power driven by coal, the spread of education, the growth of financial institutions like markets, and the globalization of trade, gross world product has increased by a factor of about 200 since the early 18th century. The Great escape from universal poverty was highly uneven across the regions of the world. The UK and the US were the first to make the Great Escape, as Angus Deaton has called it, but more recently, regions such as South Korea and Chile have escaped from grinding poverty, and China and India are starting to show exponential growth as well. Now, once again, all of this increase in prosperity would be a dubious example of progress if it was all going to the proverbial 1%. But in fact, it has gone to decimate the rate of extreme poverty, conventionally defined as US $1.90 per person per day in 2015 dollars. By that criterion, 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. That has been brought down to less than 9%. Indeed, there's been a 75% reduction in extreme poverty just in the past 3 decades. As a result, international inequality, the gap between rich countries and poor countries, after necessarily increasing with the Industrial Revolution, when a few lucky countries left the pack behind, has turned a corner and is now starting to decrease. Now, within rich countries, of course, inequality is not decreasing, it is increasing, but that doesn't mean that rich countries have become increasingly indifferent to the needs of the less well-off. Quite the contrary. Whereas up through the late 19th century, the countries of Europe devoted no more than 1.5% of their GDP to social transfers, that is, to children, to the elderly, to the sick, to the poor. In the 20th century, every developed country went on a program of social spending, so that today the median OECD country redistributes 22% of its economic output to social transfers. As a result, even in rich countries like the United States, poverty, when it is measured in terms of disposable income, that is, after government benefits, has fallen from about 1/3 in 1960 to 7% today. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, what people can afford to buy, taking into account the falling cost of food and clothing, it has gone from 30% to less than 3%. Peace. For most of human history, the natural state of relations between countries was war, and peace was merely an interlude between wars. We can see that in a graph that plots the percentage of years in each 25-year period in which the great powers of the day, the 800-pound gorillas, were at each other's throats in major wars. And what the graph shows is that 400 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Today, they are never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China in Korea more than 65 years ago. Now, if we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that even as wars were becoming shorter and less frequent, two of the ones that did occur were unprecedented in their magnitude of killing, namely World War I and World War II. But contrary to predictions that I grew up with, that it was only a matter of time before we would see World War III, pitting the United States against the Soviet Union, fought with nuclear weapons, which would dwarf even World War II. We now know that the Soviet Union went out of existence mostly peacefully, the Cold War ended, and World War III never happened. In fact, if we now zoom in on the post-war period, we see that from a rate of death in battles from all wars combined, not just the great power wars, but the smaller wars and the civil wars, from a rate of about 20 battle deaths per 100,000 per year in the late 40s, the rate of death from war has zigzagged up and down, but predominantly downward, with peaks for the around the time of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Syrian Civil War. But nonetheless, there's an unmistakable downward trend. This we can credit the growth of international institutions like the United Nations and the European Union, the increase in trade, since trade can be a pacifying force. You don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors, and general norms against conquest and against war as a means of settling disputes between nations, aided by the general valuation of human life over national glory. Freedom and rights. 200 years ago, you could probably count the number of democracies in the world on the fingers of one hand. But despite the rather terrifying setbacks to democracy in countries like Turkey and Venezuela and Russia and Hungary, if you count up not just the countries that have gone backwards, like those four, but also the countries that have become more democratic, and scale them by how democratic or autocratic they are, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in the last decade. That for the first time in history, a majority of countries are more democratic than autocratic, and a majority of human beings live in countries that are more democratic than autocratic. Lest this graph seem impossible to believe, just keep in mind that in the 1970s, when I was a high school and college student, half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and dominated by communist totalitarian dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. Most of Latin America was under the control of military juntas, as was Greece, and the industrialized countries of East Asia, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Philippines, all of them democratic today. Also, the power of governments to brutalize their citizens has been eroded, such as the death penalty, which has been abolished in country after country, most recently Malaysia, just a couple of months ago. For the last 3 decades, there have been 3 abolitions of capital punishment every year. If that trend continues, by the year 2026, capital punishment will have vanished from the face of the earth, joining other institutions such as legal slavery and human sacrifice. Homosexuality has been decriminalized in country after country, most recently India, Lebanon, and Trinidad and Tobago, just in the last year. And that was pushed along by a shift in morality from religious law and scripture to one based on human well-being. Child labor. Traditionally, children were used for their labor and set to work in farms and factories. As any reader of Charles Dickens knows, in mid-19th century, about 30% of English children were set to work in farms and factories. That was brought down by the 1930s in the United States, England, and Italy. Owing to the rise of affluence, children no longer were needed to bring income into the home. The changing premium that we place on education as opposed to physical labor, and a general valuation of the lives of children. In 2015, the Nobel Peace Prize was shared by Kailash Satyarthi for his activism in reducing child labor worldwide, and these graphs show that he has made real progress. Violent crime. In any part of the world that exists in a state of anarchy, there will be calculated predation, often followed by revenge and cycles of vendettas and blood feuds and cycles of violence. In medieval Europe, for example, the homicide rate was about 35 per 100,000 per year. That was brought down in every European country to about 1 per 100,000 per year. That sequence tends to be replicated in any part of the world in which anarchic frontier regions are brought under the rule of law. It happened in colonial New England, happened in the American Wild West, and even in countries that remain quite violent today, such as Mexico, they suffered from much higher rates of violence a century before. We zoom in on the last 50 years or so, we see that the United States, after suffering a reversal of the decline in crime, there was a crime boom in the United States from the 60s through the 80s. That has been brought down, and the world as a whole has brought its homicide rate down by about 30% just in the 21st century. Not just homicide, but also rape and domestic violence have been in decline, such as violence against wives and girlfriends and rates of rape and sexual assault, as has the victimization of children, despite the panics that, in reports of bullying and cyberbullying and so on. The rate of violent victimization of children at school has come down, as have the rates of physical abuse and sexual abuse. Indeed, we have been getting safer in just about every way, thanks to improvements in the design of automobiles and of highways and enforcement of traffic laws. Your chance of getting killed in a car crash have come down by about 96% over the last century. We are 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die by fire, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. There is, however, one exception to the trend of increasing safety, and this is the category that safety statisticians call accidental death by poison, solid, or liquid. It includes drug overdoses, and here we see the American opioid epidemic, an exception to the overall trend of life becoming safer. At the same time, we are 95% less likely to be killed on the job. We're even less likely to be killed in a so-called act of God, a drought, a flood, a wildfire, an earthquake, a volcano, a meteor strike, presumably not because God is any less angry with us, but because of improvements in the resilience of our infrastructure, in the ability to predict disasters before they happen, and in emergency response systems. And speaking of acts of God, what about the quintessential act of God? The projectile hurled by Zeus, the literal bolt from the blue. Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. The natural state of humanity is to be illiterate, and for most of human history, the ability to read and write was a perquisite of the fortunate few. About 15% of Europe in the late 15th century. European countries achieved universal literacy by the 20th century, and that is becoming true of the world as a whole. Right now, 80% of the world can read and write, 90% of the world under the age of 25. Not just men, but women, whereas in 1750, only 6 English women could read for every 10 men who could, but England achieved universal gender parity in literacy by the turn of the 20th century, and the world is very, very close to achieving gender parity in literacy. Even the most backward countries, when it comes to educating girls, Pakistan and Afghanistan, have shown huge increases. That, of course, may be associated with the other winner of the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize, Malala Yousafzai. And in perhaps the most incredible, astonishing, difficult to swallow example of progress that I have come across, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-documented phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores have been increasing by 3 points a decade for about a century, a dividend of the expansion of education and of the trickle-down of technical and abstract concepts from academia and science into everyday life. Okay, well, as is fitting in a lecture sponsored by the Eudaimonia Institute, does this improve the quality of our lives? These are all the kinds of things that economists like to measure, but do they actually make a difference into as far as our lived experience is concerned? In many ways, yes. For example, 150 years ago, the typical work week in the United States and Europe was more than 60 hours. That has come down to fewer than 40 hours, and an average worker today gets 3 weeks of paid vacation, which would have been virtually inconceivable in the 19th century. And thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we forfeit to housework, which people indicate is their least favorite way of spending their time, has gone down from 60 hours a week to fewer than 15 hours a week. Because of the shorter work week and the less amount of time that we waste on housework, the amount of leisure time in the United States has increased over the last 50 years, both for men and for women. And now you can't help but notice that the advance for women stopped and even went into reverse in the 1990s. The reason is that women today spend more time with their children, that a single working woman today spends more hours with her children than a stay-at-home mom did in the 1950s. So forget your stereotypes from Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. We also have to fork over less of our paychecks for the necessities of life, from 60% a century ago to about 1/3 today. Again, returning to the theme of this institute, does all this make us any happier? And the answer is, on average, it does. There is a strong relationship between subjectively rated well-being and GDP per capita, a logarithmic relationship, because obviously an extra $100 goes farther to improving the happiness of a poor person than a rich person. But nonetheless, it is found in all countries. People in richer countries are happier. Richer people in every country are happier than poorer people. And so one would expect that as the world got richer, its people ought to become happier. As best we can tell from the data sets that do try to track happiness over time, that is true. In 71% of countries for which we have data going back 30 years or more, happiness has increased. Interestingly, the United States is not one of them. Happiness has decreased slightly in the United States, but the United States was a pretty happy country in the first place. And contrary to a widespread understanding that suicide rates have been soaring, that is not true. Quite the contrary. Worldwide suicide rates have fallen by about 40% in the last 3 decades. That is true in a majority of countries. Once again, the United States is not one of them. The American suicide rate has been creeping upward. However, it's been creeping upward from its low point in 1999. And in earlier periods in American history, the suicide rate was far higher. Well, has all this progress come at the expense of the environment? And the answer is, of course it has. However, in developed countries, that is starting to turn, and the environment is beginning to rebound. In fact, in 178 out of 180 countries, the overall report card for the environment has improved in the last 10 years. I'll just give you some data from the United States. That since the passage of the the passage of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, American population has increased by 40%. Our GDP has increased by 2.5%. We drive twice as many miles as people did in the 1970s. However, the rate of emissions of the 5 major air pollutants has gone down by an average of 60%. The rate of deforestation in temperate parts of the world has come down to 0 or perhaps even negative as farms are abandoned and are reclaimed by forest. In the tropical world, alarmingly, deforestation continues, but at least it has come down since its peak in the 1980s. The amount of the world's surface that is protected from economic exploitation has doubled from 7.5% to 15% of the Earth's surface, as has the amount of the world's ocean cover. And the biggest pressure on the environment, namely human population, has peaked in the 1970s and is now plummeting, and projections of population that take into account the reduction in population growth with urbanization, education, and women's empowerment suggest that the world population may peak in 2070 and begin to decline. Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of having a rosy disposition or seeing the glass as half full. It is an empirically demonstrable fact. So how is the fact of human progress reflected in the news? Well, I'll give you one more graph, which shows the result of an algorithmic analysis of the emotional tone of the news, a tally of positive and negative words in news stories, which shows that over the past 70 years, as our lives have become longer, healthier, safer, richer, more peaceful, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose, and a summary of the world's broadcasts has gotten glummer and glummer as well. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer comes from an interaction between the nature of human cognition and the nature of news. Now, the cognitive psychologists, beginning with Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, have shown that people tend to estimate risk using a mental shortcut they call the availability heuristic. Namely, the more easily we can recall examples from memory, the more likely we think that kind of event is. For example, if you ask people to rank various causes of death, they'll say that tornadoes kill more people than asthma attacks. In reality, asthma attacks kill about 40 times the number of people that are killed by tornadoes, but tornadoes make for really good television. Asthma attacks, not so much. Indeed, consider the nature of news. News is about stuff that happens, not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, "I'm reporting live from a country that is at peace," or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. Also, news is about sudden events, not gradual changes. As Max Roser has pointed out, the papers could have run the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline with the result that more than 1 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. Also, there is a bias toward the negative in the culture of journalism. Journalists consider it to be their duty to prevent people from slipping into complacency. As captured by a headline from the satirical newspaper The Onion, CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Well, if you combine the nature of journalism with the nature of cognition, you can see why the world is coming to an end, and always has been. There's also a negativity bias in our own brains. That psychologists know that psychologically speaking, bad is stronger than good. There are more words for negative emotions than for positive emotions. We think about and feel bad events more than good ones. We dread losses more than we anticipate gains. Especially when it comes to recent bad events. We actually remember bad events from the distant past reasonably well, but we tend to forget how bad they were at the time. Explaining an observation by Franklin Pierce Adams that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. There's also a market among would-be prophets. Pessimism sounds serious, gives you gravitas. Optimism sounds frivolous. An optimist sounds like he's trying to sell you something. As the musical satirist Tom Lehrer put it, always predict the worst and you'll be hailed as a prophet. Well, let me wrap up with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I suspect have occurred to many of you. The first is, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to avoid being overcome by complacency, to speak truth to power, to afflict the comfortable? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we have to be aware of problems and suffering and injustice wherever they occur, but we also ought to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because there are dangers of ignorant and thoughtless pessimism that can counteract whatever dangers there are in complacency. One of them is fatalism. If you think that all our efforts to make the world a better place have miserably failed and things just get worse and worse and worse, well, why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? Why throw good money after bad? As Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. The other danger is radicalism. If you think that all our institutions are failing and beyond all hopes for reform, you'll be open to calls to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground out of the hope that anything that rises out of the ashes will be better than what we have now, or to empower an aspiring leader who promises, only I can fix it. Second question, is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that must be solved in their turn. Also, at the same time that there can be gradual progress, the world can be blindsided by nasty surprises, and I've mentioned a number of them, such as the 2 world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, and the American opioid epidemic. And the world continues to face severe challenges that we have not solved, foremost among them being climate change and the threat of nuclear war. I deal with these in lengthy discussions in the book, in which I suggest that we treat these as unsolved but solvable problems rather than as apocalypses in waiting, that we deal with the threat of climate change by decarbonizing the world's economy as rapidly as possible via a combination of policy, such as carbon pricing and the development of low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies, and that we deal with the threat of nuclear war by denuclearizing the international stage via strategic stability that makes it less necessary to rely on nuclear weapons, and in programs of arms limitation and reduction, culminating eventually in the total abolition of all nuclear weapons, the target known as Global Zero. Just to show that these are not utopian, romantic hopes, it is possible to create wealth without a constant level of emission of greenhouse gases. If you look over the course of history as how much CO2 is emitted per dollar of GDP, of wealth created, see that countries tend to follow an arc of where, as they first industrialize, they use wood and coal, which emit a lot of carbon. Then they turn to petroleum, then to natural gas, then to renewables and nuclear and hydro. That happened in the UK, the US, and China. It's happening now in India, and it's happened in the world as a whole. Now, this does not mean that we are on track to dealing with climate change, for two reasons. One of them is that at the same time as it takes less carbon to produce a given amount of wealth, we are increasing the amount of wealth that we produce. And the fact that these emissions can't just be reduced, but they have to go zero and eventually negative. But it does show that the creation of wealth in an industrial society is not inherently tied to flaming carbon. And despite the often terrifying state of the world's nuclear arsenals, few people realize that they have come way down. Nuclear arms have been reduced by about 85% since the peak of the Cold War. There are recent developments that are cause for worry, if not alarm, the potential of starting a new arms race, but these graphs should not make us complacent, but just rather embolden us to see that reduction in nuclear arms actually can take place. My final question: does the Enlightenment just go against human nature? Is humanism just too arid or tepid or flattened to get the people's blood pumping? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I'm not so sure. We know that secular liberal democracies are the happiest and healthiest places on earth, those with the highest eudaimonia, I would say, and they are the top destination of people who vote with their feet. And I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, maybe even spiritual. It is not just another hero myth, because myths are fictions, and this one is true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it is a heroic story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity, because it depends on nothing more than the convictions that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, peace is better than war, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you.